In a prior video, we looked at some of the worst examples of changing up a wrestler's gimmick, those times when a new persona pushed a performer down the card. But what about when a change of character goes right? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into Second Time Lucky, wrestling's upgraded gimmicks. And as always, if we're going to start anywhere, we really should start right at the top of the pile, because when it comes to successfully upgraded gimmicks, there are few, if any, better examples than the time the Ringmaster morphed into Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, after joining the WWF in late 1995, things didn't look like they were going to go too well for the Texas Rattlesnake, as the initial role he was given to play was that of a good technical wrestler who never spoke and always paraded Ted DiBiase's $1 million title around with him wherever he went. And sure, this might have been a decent enough gimmick for a journeyman performer to carve out a role for himself on the show with, but not for the man who would go on to become the biggest draw in the history of the industry. So thank God, as we got deeper into 1996, Austin was allowed to start changing things up when, following DiBiase's exit from the company, the Texan began getting more mic time. And as he was doing this, he was also shaving his head and growing a goatee in order to more closely resemble notorious hitman, the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski. But that wasn't all, because he was also creating a new name for himself, one which better fit his new, colder, more assassin-like direction. And where did this name come from? Well, it happened when, upon making him a cup of tea one morning, Austin's wife at the time, English-born Jeannie Clark, advised him to drink it before it got stone cold. After that then, Stone Cold Steve Austin was off to the races, and soon enough, this led to him winning the King of the Ring in June. Of course, it was also at that point he fully completed his transition to the man he'd become when, upon delivering his now iconic Austin 316 promo, he was suddenly the coolest anti-hero on the planet in fans' eyes, one who perfectly fit in with the shifting pop culture landscape of the 90s. And despite the company continuing to push him as a heel for a while yet, this new gimmick would eventually see him become the most popular character in all of wrestling. That said, there was one figure that could compete with him during the turn of the millennium in terms of fan support, but Rocky Maivia would have likely never gotten to that point either if he had not successfully morphed into The Rock in 1997. Sure, it's easy to look back now and think Dwayne Johnson was always destined to be a megastar given the sheer amount of charisma he has. During his early run in WWF, however, this was not the case. And this was because, while he was certainly an athletic performer with a lot of potential, none of his cocky charms were allowed to shine under the gimmick of Rocky Maivia, the blandest, most white meat babyface of all babyfaces who wanted to do nothing more than smile and try his best. So needless to say, this quickly saw fans turn on him, as during the first half of 1996, so vicious was the backlash against him, it wasn't uncommon to see signs in the crowd which read, "Die, Rocky, die." But that's exactly why it turned out to be such a blessing in disguise then that Rocky got injured in April of 96, as this forced him to take some time away in order to recalculate. And it was while doing this that both he and Vince McMahon decided the best way to go forward was for him to lean into fans' reaction and turn heel. Of course, this turned out to be an excellent decision in the long run, because upon joining the Nation of Domination and rebranding himself as The Rock, Dwayne Johnson was suddenly able to let all his cocky charms come out in the form of some great heel promos. Seriously, whether it was mocking fans by calling himself the People's Champion, raising an eyebrow in disgust at all who opposed him, or ethering his stablemate Farouk in promos without saying a single word, merely rolling his eyes, it quickly became clear that The Rock was going to be the future of the company. So as his popularity rose, WWE were forced to turn him babyface, something which proved to be fortuitous, as when Steve Austin went down to injury in late 1999, the Great One was right there to pick up his mantle as the face of the company, and in the process, become an even bigger mainstream star than the Rattlesnake had ever been. Then from there, he'd use this mainstream popularity to segue into a career in Hollywood where, by the 2010s, he'd be the biggest movie star in the world. And just to think, none of it might have happened had he not decided to turn heel back in 1997. But not every upgraded gimmick has quite as much success as this, of course. That said, it doesn't make these other attempts any less successful in their own right, because if we start comparing everyone to The Rock, then they're all going to look bad by comparison. No, in many cases, while it hasn't led to a Hollywood career, a new character has still done wonders in reviving someone's career from the jaws of death. And if you want any evidence of this, you need look no further than the time Max Dupree reverted back to his old gimmick of LA Knight, in 2023. And yes, we know he was already LA Knight before this, so in many ways it represents a return to the old. But that old gimmick was so much better for his career than Dupree was, as it meant that he'd now get a chance to let his verbal skills shine again. And make no mistake about it, it's in his verbal skills where LA Knight's strengths lie, something he's proven not only during his time in TNA and NWA, but also across his run on NXT in 2021 and 2022. Unfortunately though, once he was moved up to the main roster the following year, he was rebranded as Max Dupree, the manager of Maximum Male Models. And while you won't hear us say anything negative about Massey and Mansois, our fabulous fashion overlords, this really wasn't the best fit for Knight, as it pegged him as a comedy character right off the bat. So luckily, once Triple H took over creative later that year, Max Dupree would be no more, and once again, LA Knight would be asking fans everywhere, "Let me talk to ya, yeah." And this has meant that, now able to be taken seriously again, there's every possibility he'll continue to rise up the card and maybe one day even win some main roster gold. But if he wants to do this, he'll have some competition on the roster from another mid-card star who, despite now being in the later run of his career, is still searching for another title. And sure, in the case of Luke Gallows, it might be the tag title belts he's more likely to win at this point, but he probably wouldn't have risen this high had he not transformed from the role of Festus in 2009. That's right, Festus, one of the worst gimmicks of the 2000s. But why was it so bad? Well, it's because the idea here was that Gallows was playing a mentally challenged man who was basically catatonic. Of course, all that changed once the bell rang, however, as at this point, he'd suddenly turn into a brawling monster, one who could mow through opponents at will. Needless to say then, this one had a very definitive shelf life, and so it's probably for the best that, after a brief run under the Festus name, the rookie was recruited into CM Punk's Straight Edge Society, where the whole thing was retconned to suggest he'd merely been an addict who needed to get clean. And now clean then, he'd revert back to what we were told was his real name of Luke Gallows, something which proved to be a godsend for him in the long run, as now no longer being saddled with a budget Eugene gimmick, the Maryland native was able to get over as a popular mid-card act. Hell, by the 2010s, he'd even have partnered up with Carl Anderson and become a member of the Bullet Club over in Japan, a membership he still maintains to this day, even if he is back in the WWE again. But for as popular as Bullet Club continues to be, the original is still, in many fans' eyes, superior. And that original would have never happened had Hulk Hogan not become Hollywood Hogan and started the NWO in 1996. And this one was very much needed, as come the mid-90s, the Hulkamania train was struggling to stay on track. That's right, after years of this shtick, fans were growing tired of Terry Bollea, and that led to him getting regularly booed at shows once he signed for WCW. So realizing he needed to shake things up then, Hogan took the advice of Eric Bischoff and agreed to do the unthinkable at 1996's Bash at the Beach by turning heel. And when he did this by dropping a big leg on Randy Savage, then aligning himself with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, it drew nuclear heat from fans who, while they might have been tired of him prior to this, suddenly remembered how big a part of their childhood he'd been. But that was only part of the betrayal, as it happened, because from there, now rebranding himself as Hollywood Hogan, the Hulkster became the leader of the New World Order and led them in an invasion of WCW. Of course, this turned out not only to be a massively successful angle, and one which led WCW to ratings victories over their competition for 83 consecutive weeks, but it also completely revived Terry Bollea's career and made him arguably more relevant than ever. Yes, like Fat Elvis and Skinny Elvis, both Hollywood and Hulk Hogan are equally as important in terms of their pop culture impact. And given how big a deal the babyface side of this equation was in the 80s, that's saying quite a lot. Hell, even to this day, you're just as likely to see someone wearing an NWO t-shirt as you are a Hulkamania one. That said, he's not the only original NWO member who saved their career with an upgraded gimmick, because a couple of years prior to this, Kevin Nash was shaking off the shackles of Vinny Vegas in order to become Diesel. In order to do this, however, he had to switch employers, because it was during his first run with World Championship Wrestling that, after a series of bad characters such as Oz and Master Blaster Steel, he'd be given the job of getting the pseudo-mobster over. But while this was a somewhat fun role for him to play at first, something it most certainly wasn't was main event. So seeing a ceiling on what he could achieve in Atlanta at the time then, Nash took the offer from WWF to go there in 1993 and transform himself into Diesel. And sure, this one was originally mid-card too, in that it was pegged to be nothing more than a bodyguard for Shawn Michaels. But after a breakout performance at the 1994 Royal Rumble, Vince McMahon suddenly realized he had a new top star on his hands. So that was why, come the end of the year, not only would Diesel have gone solo, but he'd have beaten Bob Backlund in just 8 seconds to become WWF champion. And from there, he was a made man, enough to where, once he returned to WCW in 1996, he could command a big money contract. Of course, these big money contracts didn't always go down well with his peers, who often felt like they had to work twice as hard to earn half as much. But for someone like Booker T, he needn't have worried too much, because by the time he joined WWE and morphed into King Booker, he was ready to reach the main event himself. But wait, we hear you say, wasn't Booker T already awesome before this? Well, yes, he was great as the 5-time WCW champion. And he was also great as the upper mid-card act he became in WWE after signing with them in 2001. That said, it wouldn't be until he won the King of the Ring in 2006 and became King Booker that he reached a level enough to where Vince McMahon finally saw him as top title material. Yes, after playing up to his comedy skills and adopting a ridiculous English accent, King Booker became what everyone knew he could be, and that was the most entertaining thing on SmackDown. But it wasn't just him, of course, because now with his court around him, made up as they were of Queen Sharmell, Sir William Regal, and Sir Finlay, and Hornswoggle, the Houston native was able to shine for the boss in a way he never had before. And that's what ultimately makes this one such a successful gimmick upgrade, as it got Booker over with the boss, something which led to him being given the World Heavyweight title to run with for the second half of that year. Yes, he was great prior to that, but as we all know, it's not about what fans want in WWE, it's about what Vince McMahon wants. So getting him on his side proved to be the final piece of the puzzle for the former WCW champion. But not every great gimmick upgrade has gotten over with the boss so easily, though. No, sometimes no matter how good something is, he just doesn't get it at all. And if you need an example of this, you only have to look at the way he treated Matt Hardy when he brought his Broken character to WWE in 2017. Of course, prior to that though, Broken Matt Hardy was probably the highlight of the North Carolinian's career, as for the first time, he was able to step out of the shadows of his brother Jeff and prove he had what it took to be a big star in his own right. And boy did he prove this here, because after taking a few too many blows to the head in 2016 during a run in TNA, he'd return, now seemingly believing he was an anime supervillain, one who spoke in an inexplicable English accent, who had a gray streak running through his hair. But that wasn't all. No, aside from his obsession with deleting his opponents, most notably Brother Nero, Broken Matt built a whole universe of weirdness around him. And that included not only his help and real-life father-in-law, Senor Benjamin, but his personal drone, Vanguard 1, and his son, King Maxwell, too. Seriously, it was all so weird that few people were sure what to make of it at first. But once everyone got a chance to see the final deletion, the precursor to every cinematic match which came in 2020, they were each on board with what Matt Hardy was doing. Hell, so successful a gimmick change was this that it would even carry on once Matt left TNA and joined WWE again in 2017, though this time it would be under the slightly altered name of Woken Matt Hardy. And when the former tag team champion jumped to AEW in 2020, he'd bring the Broken Universe along for the ride there too, as he had further cinematic matches against the likes of Sammy Guevara. But while this probably qualifies him as being one of the most successful people when it comes to getting a supernatural gimmick over, he isn't at the top of that list. No, realistically, there's only one man who can take that spot, and that's Mark Calloway, because when he transformed from Mean Mark to The Undertaker in 1990, it changed the game forever. That's right, it's arguably the greatest gimmick in wrestling history, but it wasn't always what the Texas native had to work with, as during his early days while working with WCW, he'd been given the moniker of Mean Mark Callis instead. Who was Mean Mark Callis? Well, he was basically just a big ginger guy who briefly teamed with Dan Spivey to form the Skyscrapers. After being told by Ole Anderson no one would ever pay money to see him perform though, the future world champion took this as a sign to try his luck elsewhere as he made the jump over to the WWF. And there, despite some early fears he'd be playing an Eggman, Mark got the role of a lifetime in The Undertaker, someone who was, at least during those early years, portrayed as an undead zombie mortician. Of course, to listen to it without context, it sounds like the stupidest idea ever, and had it been anyone else in the role, it likely would have failed. But with Mark Calaway behind the wheel, The Undertaker turned into the longest-running and most successful gimmick in WWE history. So much so that he was still competing in matches as far on as 2020. Seriously, after debuting at the 1990 Survivor Series, the Phenom became such a hit with fans all over the world that, despite originally being pegged as the next big heel monster, he'd soon turn babyface and become an anti-hero for goth kids everywhere. And following that, now a made man in a gimmick which realistically should have never lasted longer than a year, he spent the next couple of decades transforming the character from Mortician to Lord of Darkness to Cult Leader to Biker to Last Outlaw, each incarnation of which was just as successful as the last. Yes, in terms of an upgraded gimmick, it's hard to argue that this isn't the most successful of all time in terms of how much of a step up it was. After all, how do you argue with someone who's a 7-time world champion, 2-time Wrestling Hall of Famer, and 5-time WrestleMania main eventer? But while not every upgraded gimmick can be quite as successful as this, it doesn't mean they aren't without their own merits as well. And we can say that for certain because taking a tag team who were little more than lackeys to the Phenom during his Lord of Darkness days and turning the whole thing into one of the most enduring gimmicks in company history is no small feat. But then we suppose when the Acolytes became the APA, it couldn't have been anything less. That's right, after first partnering up to form the resident muscle of the Ministry of Darkness in 1999, Bradshaw and Farouk quickly found a kinship with each other. So when the Ministry fell apart later that year then, the two decided that they wanted to continue teaming up. But while Vince McMahon agreed with them on this subject, he no longer wanted them to play the role of Acolytes going forward. And that was why, in searching for a new gimmick for the pair, he'd fall back on the mantra that all the best characters are just the real people with the volume turned up. And who were the real Bradshaw and Farouk? Well, they were hard-drinking Southern guys who liked to fight, so that's what they became on screen too then, as they formed the Acolyte Protection Agency soon thereafter, an endeavor which allowed them to sit backstage, playing cards and drinking, all while waiting for someone to come and procure their services. Of course, whenever someone did come seeking their help, it was all go, as providing they had the money, the APA accompanied them down to the ring and acted as their personal security. And this led to some great segments where the former Acolytes absolutely murdered some poor unsuspecting heels, all before they then returned to their makeshift office backstage and celebrated with a few more beers. So in that sense, this Has to Work is not only an upgrade for fans, but also an upgrade for the performers involved too, because who wouldn't want to get paid to play this role? That said, for as fun as being a member of the APA seemed, it wasn't the only tag team in WWF at the time which looked like a blast to be involved in because, while they were drinking and playing poker, elsewhere on the show, Too Cool were dancing to their heart's content. Not that it had always been this way for them though, as when Scott Taylor and Brian Christopher first came together in 1998, they'd be known as Too Much. And this didn't really allow them to show much of their character as it happened, because they'd pretty much just be presented as undercard jobbers. Come late 1999 though, something changed, as after transforming into Scotty 2 Hotty and Grandmaster Sexay respectively, the pair rebranded themselves as Too Cool, and finally let their personalities shine. And as far as what this personality entailed, well, it was basically two white boy dancers who seemed to think they were the coolest people in the room, something which couldn't be further from the truth. As time went on though, and fans started to get behind Too Cool's antics, they actually became what they thought they were. Need any evidence of this? Just ask any kid for the late 90s to do the worm, and they'll immediately know what you're talking about. After all, outside of the People's Elbow, never has a finisher so ridiculous gotten over in such a big way. And when Rikishi joined the group and turned it into a trio soon after that, things went to a whole new level again, as suddenly this once undercard comedy act were taken straight up to the main event scene, where they got to challenge the likes of D-Generation X on episodes of Raw. Hell, at the 2000 Royal Rumble, they even stole the show from everyone else in the match when they had a dance break right in the middle of it. So it just goes to show that even if you start off on the bottom rung, you're always just one good gimmick upgrade away from reaching the stars.